In the autumn of 1847, in the misty mountains of Takayama, a young woman named Yuki kneels silently in the Crimson Lotus tea house, her delicate hands moving gracefully as she serves tea to customers who will never hear her voice. Born without the ability to speak, she has learned to communicate through the subtle language of gestures, expressions, and the haunting melodies she plays on her shamisen when the moon is high and the world sleeps. Tell me in the comments where you're listening to this story from, and what moves you most about a good period romance. Prepare yourself to experience a period romance full of dignity, second chances, and emotions that will never be forgotten. Can a warrior's hardened heart learn to hear the music that flows from silence? Will love find a way to bridge the gap between a man who speaks only through violence and a woman whose voice exists only in her soul? And if you love stories like this, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to Whispers of Silk for more tales that will touch your heart. Act 1. The Silent Flower. The mountain town of Takayama, nestled in the Japanese Alps like a jewel hidden in a velvet box, its traditional wooden buildings rising in terraced layers against the steep hillsides that surrounded it on all sides. The year 1847 had brought an early autumn to the region, painting the maple trees in brilliant shades of crimson and gold that seemed to set the entire landscape ablaze with color. The air carried the crisp scent of mountain streams and the smoke from countless hearth fires, while the distant sound of temple bells marked the passage of time with their bronze voices echoing off the surrounding peaks. The Crimson Lotus Tea House stood on a narrow street in the heart of the old quarter, its dark wooden facade weathered by decades of mountain winters, but still maintaining the elegant proportions that marked it as a place of refinement and culture. Paper lanterns hung from its eaves like captured stars, their warm lights spilling onto the cobblestones below and creating pools of golden illumination in the gathering dusk. The building's interior was a masterpiece of traditional design, with tatami mats covering floors that had been polished to a mirror shine, sliding screens painted with scenes of cranes and cherry blossoms, and alcoves displaying seasonal flower arrangements that changed with the rhythm of the natural world. This was not merely a tea house, but a sanctuary, where the arts flourished under the patronage of wealthy merchants and traveling nobles who appreciated beauty in all its forms. The establishment was renowned throughout the region for the quality of its entertainment, the skill of its performers, and the discretion of its management. Here, powerful men could escape the pressures of their public lives and lose themselves in an atmosphere of cultivated pleasure and aesthetic refinement. Among the tea house's most prized entertainers was a young woman known simply as Yuki, whose name meant snow, and whose presence seemed to bring a sense of peace and tranquility to even the most troubled souls. At 19 years of age, she possessed a beauty that was both ethereal and deeply human, with features that seemed to have been carved from the finest porcelain by a master craftsman who understood that true artistry lay not in perfection, but in the subtle imperfections that made each face unique and memorable. Her skin was pale as moonlight on fresh snow, unmarked by the harsh sun that weathered the faces of common laborers, and her dark hair was always arranged in elaborate styles that showcased the delicate curve of her neck and the graceful line of her shoulders. Her eyes, large and expressive, seemed to hold depths of emotion that spoke more eloquently than any words could convey, and her movements possessed a fluid grace that made even the simple act of pouring tea seem like a form of dance. But what made Yuki truly unique among the entertainers of the Crimson Lotus was not her beauty or her grace, but her silence. Born without the ability to speak, she had never uttered a single word in her 19 years of life, communicating instead through a complex language of gestures, expressions, and written characters that she had mastered with the dedication of a scholar. Her muteness, which might have been seen as a disability in another context, had become part of her mystique in the rarefied atmosphere of the tea house, where her silence was interpreted as a form of profound wisdom and spiritual depth. The Mama-san of the Crimson Lotus, a woman named Hanako, whose own beauty had once graced the most exclusive establishments in Kyoto, had discovered Yuki as a child begging in the streets of a distant village. The girl's parents had died in a plague that swept through the mountain regions, leaving her alone and defenseless in a world that had little patience for those who could not speak for themselves. Hanako had seen something special in the silent child, a quality that transcended her obvious disadvantages and suggested possibilities that others might overlook. Under Hanako's careful guidance, Yuki had been trained in all the traditional arts that defined a refined entertainer. She had learned to move with the flowing grace of a classical dancer, to arrange flowers with the precision of a master artist, to conduct the tea ceremony with the reverence of a priestess serving at a sacred altar. But perhaps most remarkably, she had developed an extraordinary ability to play the shamisen, the three-stringed instrument that was the heart of traditional Japanese music. When Yuki played, her silence seemed to transform into something transcendent, as if all the words she had never spoken were flowing through her fingertips and into the strings of her instrument. Her music possessed a haunting quality that could move listeners to tears, a depth of emotion that spoke directly to the soul, without the need for lyrics or explanation. Customers would sit in rapt attention as she performed, their conversations dying away as they became lost in melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of human longing and hope. On this particular autumn evening, as the last light of day faded behind the mountain peaks and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Yuki knelt in the main reception hall of the Crimson Lotus, her shamisen resting across her knees as she waited for the evening's entertainment to begin. The room was filled with the soft murmur of conversation, as customers settled onto silk cushions and servants moved quietly between them, serving tea and sake, with the practiced efficiency of those who understood that their role was to remain invisible while facilitating the pleasure of others. The clientele this evening was typical of the Crimson Lotus's usual patrons: wealthy merchants from the lowlands, minor nobles traveling between their estates, and local officials whose positions afforded them the luxury of such refined entertainment. They were men of education and culture, accustomed to the finer things in life and capable of appreciating the subtle artistry that distinguished a place like the Crimson Lotus from the cruder establishments that catered to less sophisticated tastes. But as Yuki surveyed the room with her expressive eyes, she noticed a figure that seemed distinctly out of place among the usual gathering of refined gentlemen. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden in the shadows cast by a decorative screen, sat a man whose presence seemed to radiate a barely contained violence that made the very air around him feel charged with danger. He was tall and lean, with the corded muscles of someone who had spent years training his body as a weapon, and his clothes, while clean and well-maintained, bore the simple, practical design favored by those who valued function over fashion. 2 swords rested at his side, their worn hilts suggesting weapons that had seen considerable use, and his posture, even in repose, carried the alertness of a predator ready to spring into action at the first sign of threat. But what struck Yuki most forcefully about the stranger was his face, which bore the kind of scars that could only come from years of violent conflict. A thin white line ran from his left temple to his jaw, while another crossed his right cheek like a pale lightning bolt frozen in flesh. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. This was clearly a ronin, one of the masterless samurai who wandered Japan's roads, seeking employment or purpose after losing their lords to death, disgrace, or political upheaval. Such men were often viewed with suspicion and fear by ordinary citizens, as their skills in violence and their lack of social constraints made them unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Most establishments of the Crimson Lotus's caliber would have refused entry to such a person, but Hanako was known for her ability to read character beneath surface appearances, and she had apparently seen something in this particular ronin that warranted taking the risk. As the evening's entertainment began with a performance by one of the other geishas, Yuki found herself stealing glances at the mysterious stranger, trying to understand what had brought such a man to a place dedicated to beauty and refinement. His presence seemed to create a bubble of tension in the otherwise peaceful atmosphere, as if the other customers could sense the potential for violence that surrounded him like an invisible aura. The ronin, for his part, seemed to be making an effort to blend into his surroundings, sitting quietly and observing the performances with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. When sake was offered, he accepted it with a polite bow, and when the geisha performing near his table smiled in his direction, he responded with a slight nod that suggested respect rather than the leering interest that some customers displayed. But Yuki noticed that his eyes kept returning to her, studying her with an intensity that made her feel both uncomfortable and strangely intrigued. There was something in his gaze that went beyond mere physical attraction, a quality of recognition, as if he saw something in her that others missed. It was the look of someone who understood what it meant to be set apart from the world, to carry burdens that could not be easily shared or explained. When her turn came to perform, Yuki rose gracefully and moved to the center of the room, her shamisen cradled in her arms like a beloved child. The conversations around the room gradually died away as customers turned their attention to the silent geisha whose music had become legendary throughout the mountain region. She settled onto a silk cushion, arranged her kimono with practiced precision, and lifted her instrument to begin her performance. The first notes that flowed from her shamisen seemed to capture the very essence of the autumn evening, with melodies that spoke of falling leaves and cooling air, of the melancholy beauty that came with the changing of seasons. Her fingers moved across the strings with the confidence of years of practice, drawing forth sounds that ranged from whisper-soft to powerfully resonant, creating a musical landscape that transported her listeners to a world where emotion could be expressed without the need for words. As she played, Yuki found herself drawn repeatedly to the Ronin's corner of the room, where he sat in absolute stillness, his scarred face transformed by an expression of wonder that seemed to strip away years of hardness and reveal the man he might have been before violence became his trade. His eyes never left her face, and she could see in them a depth of understanding that suggested he heard not just her music but the silence from which it emerged. The piece she had chosen was one of her own compositions, a melody that spoke of longing and loss, of dreams deferred and hopes that refused to die despite the weight of circumstance. It was music born from her own experience of being trapped between worlds, neither fully part of the speaking world, nor entirely separate from it, existing in a space where communication took forms that others struggled to understand. As the final notes faded into the hushed atmosphere of the tea house, the room erupted in appreciative murmurs, and the soft sound of hands clapping in approval. Customers nodded to each other with the satisfaction of those who had witnessed something truly exceptional, and several called out compliments that Yuki acknowledged with graceful bows, her silence adding an air of mystery to her acceptance of their praise. But it was the Ronin's reaction that captured her attention most completely. He had not applauded or called out like the others, but instead sat in continued stillness, his eyes closed as if he were still listening to echoes of her music that lingered in the air around him. When he finally opened his eyes and looked at her, she saw something in his expression that took her breath away, a recognition so profound it seemed to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. After the formal entertainment concluded, and the customers began to disperse into smaller groups for more intimate conversations, Yuki found herself approached by Hanako, who gestured for her to follow to a quiet alcove where they could speak privately. The mama-san's face bore an expression of curiosity mixed with concern, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that had unexpected implications. "The Ronin has requested a private audience with you," Hanako said, her voice pitched low to avoid being overheard by the other customers. "He says he wishes to discuss music and poetry, nothing more. I have told him that such a meeting would be highly unusual, given your circumstances, but he has offered to pay handsomely for the privilege." Yuki felt her heart begin to race at the unexpected request. Private audiences were not uncommon in establishments like the Crimson Lotus, but they typically involved customers who had developed ongoing relationships with particular entertainers over time. For a stranger, especially one as potentially dangerous as the scarred Ronin, to make such a request after a single evening was both flattering and alarming. She looked toward the corner where the Ronin still sat, now engaged in quiet conversation with one of the tea house's male servants, who was apparently explaining some aspect of the evening's entertainment. Even in casual conversation, he maintained the alert posture of someone who never fully relaxed, but there was nothing in his demeanor that suggested any improper intentions toward her. "What do you think?" Hanako asked, studying Yuki's face for any sign of her feelings about the proposal. "I confess I am curious about this man myself. He is clearly educated and well-mannered, despite his obvious profession, and he has shown nothing but respect for our establishment and its customs. But he is also dangerous in ways that our usual customers are not." Yuki considered the request carefully, weighing the potential risks against her own curiosity about the mysterious stranger who had listened to her music with such profound attention. There was something about him that called to her, a quality of isolation that mirrored her own experience of being set apart from the normal flow of human interaction. Perhaps in their differences they might find a common ground that would allow for genuine communication, Finally, she nodded to Hanako, indicating her willingness to meet with the Ronin under the proper supervision and safeguards that the tea house maintained for such encounters. The Mama-san smiled and patted her hand gently, understanding that this decision represented a step into unknown territory for the young woman who had always been more comfortable expressing herself through music than through direct human contact. "Very well," Hanako said. "I will arrange for you to meet in the small garden pavilion behind the main building. It is private enough for conversation but open enough that help can reach you quickly if needed. And I will have Kisuke stationed nearby, just in case our guest proves to be less honorable than he appears." As Hanako moved away to make the arrangements, Yuki remained in the alcove, her mind racing with questions about what the Ronin might want to discuss with her. His request to talk about music and poetry suggested interests that went beyond the usual pursuits of a wandering warrior. But she had learned to be cautious about assuming that surface appearances revealed the full truth about anyone. 20 minutes later, she found herself walking through the tea house's carefully tended garden toward a small pavilion that stood beside a pond filled with golden carp. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of chrysanthemums and the distant smoke of cooking fires from the town below. Paper lanterns had been hung around the pavilion to provide light for the meeting, their warm glow creating an intimate atmosphere that seemed designed for quiet conversation and contemplation. The Ronin was already waiting when she arrived, standing beside the pond with his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the carp swimming in lazy circles beneath the surface of the water. He had removed his swords and left them at a respectful distance, a gesture that spoke of his understanding of proper etiquette and his desire to put her at ease. When he heard her approach, he turned and bowed deeply, his movements carrying the precise formality of someone who had been trained in court manners despite his current circumstances. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," he said, his voice deep and carefully modulated. "I am Takeshi Nakamura, formerly in service to Lord Matsudaira of Echizen Province." Yuki returned his bow with equal formality, then gestured toward the cushions that had been arranged in the pavilion for their conversation. As they settled themselves in the traditional seiza position, she studied his face in the lantern light, noting the way the scars seemed to fade into insignificance when his features were relaxed and his eyes held no hint of the violence that his profession required. "I must confess," Takeshi continued, "that I have never encountered music quite like what you performed this evening. There was something in your playing that spoke to experiences I thought were mine alone. The weight of silence, the burden of words that can never be spoken, the way isolation can become both a prison and a sanctuary." Yuki felt a flutter of surprise at his words, which seemed to demonstrate an understanding of her condition that went far beyond the superficial sympathy that most people offered. She reached for the small writing tablet and brush that she always carried, quickly composing a response in the elegant calligraphy that had become her primary means of communication with those who did not understand her gestural language. "You speak as one who knows silence intimately," she wrote, then turned the tablet so he could read her words. "What has taught you to hear what others miss?" Takeshi read her response carefully, his eyes lingering on the graceful characters that revealed not just her thoughts but her artistic training and natural elegance. When he looked up at her again, there was a sadness in his expression that seemed to age him beyond his years. "I have spent the last 3 years wandering Japan's roads," he said quietly, "carrying secrets that I can share with no one, bearing the weight of actions that cannot be undone or explained. In that time, I have learned that the deepest truths are often those that cannot be spoken aloud, and that sometimes the most profound communication happens in the spaces between words." "What secrets do you carry?" Yuki wrote, her curiosity overcoming her natural caution. Takeshi was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the pond where the carp continued their endless circling beneath the reflected light of the lanterns. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession that had been held inside for too long. "I was ordered to kill an innocent man," he said simply. "A scholar whose only crime was writing poetry that my lord considered seditious. I was told that his death was necessary for the stability of the domain, that sometimes individual lives must be sacrificed for the greater good." He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching as he struggled with memories that clearly still caused him pain. "I could not do it," he continued. When I found the scholar in his garden, reading his poems to his young daughter, I saw not a threat to be eliminated, but a father sharing beauty with his child. I warned him instead, told him to flee before other agents could be sent to complete the task I had failed to perform. And your lord discovered your disobedience? Yuki wrote, already understanding the tragic trajectory of his story. He did, Takeshi confirmed. The scholar escaped, but my failure to follow orders was seen as a betrayal of everything I had sworn to uphold. I was stripped of my position, declared dead to my family, and forced to flee before I could be executed for my defiance. Yuki felt her heart clench with sympathy for this man who had sacrificed everything for a moment of compassion, who had chosen mercy over duty and paid the ultimate price for his humanity. She understood now why he had listened to her music with such intensity. He recognized in her melodies the same isolation and longing that had become the defining characteristics of his own existence. "Do you regret your choice?" she wrote. Takeshi considered her question seriously, his gaze returning to the pond where the carp moved in their eternal dance. "I regret the pain my actions caused my family," he said finally. "I regret the loss of honor and position that my choice entailed. But I do not regret saving an innocent life, even at the cost of my own future." "Then you are not truly dishonored," Yuki wrote, her characters flowing across the tablet with passionate conviction. "Honor that requires the murder of innocents is no honor at all. You chose the harder path, the one that demanded sacrifice of yourself rather than others. That is the mark of true nobility." Takeshi stared at her words for a long moment, and when he looked up at her again, there were tears in his eyes that he made no attempt to hide. "You are the first person in 3 years to suggest that my choice might have been the right one," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everyone else has seen only failure and disgrace." "Perhaps they were listening with their ears instead of their hearts," Yuki wrote. "Sometimes the most important truths can only be heard in silence." They sat together in comfortable quiet for a while, each lost in their own thoughts as the night deepened around them, and the sounds of the tea house gradually faded into the distance. The connection that had sparked between them during her performance had deepened into something more profound, a recognition of kindred spirits, who had both learned to find meaning in the spaces where conventional society could not reach. "May I ask you something?" Takeshi said eventually, his voice soft with the intimacy that had developed between them. Yuki nodded, her brush poised over the tablet. "Your music tonight. It spoke of longing, of dreams that seem impossible to achieve. What do you dream of, in the silence of your heart?" The question struck her like a physical blow, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so perfectly aimed at the core of her deepest desires. No one had ever asked her about her dreams, her hopes for a future that seemed as distant as the stars reflected in the pond beside them. For a long moment, she hesitated, her brush hovering over the tablet, as she struggled to find words for feelings that she had never tried to articulate. Finally, she began to write, her characters flowing across the paper with the same fluid grace that marked her shamisen playing. "I dream of being heard," she wrote. "Not just my music, but my thoughts, my feelings, my true self. I dream of finding someone who can understand the language of silence, who can see past my muteness to the person I am inside. I dream of love that does not require words, of connection that transcends the barriers that separate me from the speaking world." Takeshi read her response with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was being trusted with something precious and fragile. When he finished, he set the tablet aside and looked directly into her eyes, his scarred face transformed by an expression of tenderness that seemed to illuminate him from within. "I hear you," he said simply. "Not just your words, but your heart. And what I hear is beautiful beyond description." The moments stretched between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm, connecting two souls who had found in each other something they had never dared to hope for. In the lantern light of the garden pavilion, surrounded by the gentle sounds of water and wind, a love began to bloom that would challenge everything they thought they knew about communication, connection, and the power of silence to speak truths that words could never convey. Act 2. The Language of Hearts. In the weeks that followed their first meeting, Takeshi became a regular visitor to the Crimson Lotus, always requesting Yuki's company for the evening's entertainment, and often staying late into the night for private conversations in the garden pavilion. Their relationship developed slowly, built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that grew stronger with each encounter. Hanako watched this unusual courtship with a mixture of fascination and concern. She had seen many relationships bloom within the walls of her establishment, but never one quite like this, a connection between two people who seemed to communicate more effectively in silence than most couples managed with a lifetime of words. The Ronin's devotion to Yuki was evident in every gesture, every glance, every carefully chosen phrase he spoke in her presence. For her part, Yuki found herself looking forward to Takeshi's visits with an anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. Their conversations, conducted through her written words and his spoken responses, had revealed depths of character in both of them that neither had expected to share with another person. He told her stories of his travels, of the places he had seen and the people he had encountered in his wandering years, painting pictures with words that allowed her to experience a world beyond the confines of the tea house. She in turn shared with him the poetry she wrote in the quiet hours before dawn, verses that captured her observations of the natural world and her reflections on the human condition. Her writing revealed a mind of remarkable sophistication and sensitivity, capable of finding beauty and meaning in the smallest details of daily life. Takeshi treasured these glimpses into her inner world, recognizing in her words the same artistic sensibility that made her music so compelling. But their relationship was not without its challenges. The other customers of the Crimson Lotus began to notice Takeshi's regular presence and his obvious preference for Yuki's company, leading to whispered conversations about the propriety of such an arrangement. Some questioned whether it was appropriate for a geisha to show such obvious favor to a single customer, especially one whose social status was as ambiguous as that of a masterless samurai. More troubling were the rumors that began to circulate about Takeshi's past. Stories that painted him not as a man of principle who had sacrificed everything for his beliefs, but as a coward who had fled his duties when faced with a difficult choice. These tales, whether true or false, created an atmosphere of suspicion around him that made some of the tea house's more conservative patrons uncomfortable with his presence. Hanako found herself caught between her desire to protect Yuki's happiness and her responsibility to maintain the reputation of her establishment. She had grown fond of the silent geisha over the years, seeing in her not just a valuable performer, but a daughter figure who deserved every chance at happiness that life might offer. But she also understood that the Crimson Lotus's success depended on maintaining the delicate balance of discretion and propriety that allowed powerful men to relax in its atmosphere of cultivated pleasure. The crisis came to a head on a cold November evening when Lord Ishida, one of the tea house's most important patrons, arrived unexpectedly for an evening of entertainment. A powerful daimyo from a neighboring province, Ishida was known for his traditional views and his intolerance for anything that challenged the established social order. His presence at the Crimson Lotus always commanded the full attention of the staff, as his patronage was both lucrative and influential. On this particular evening, Ishida had brought with him several retainers and business associates, men who shared his conservative outlook and his expectation that the world would conform to their vision of proper behavior. They settled into the main reception hall with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to having their every whim catered to, calling for the finest sake and the most skilled entertainers the house could provide. Yuki was, naturally, among those summoned to perform for the distinguished guests. She took her place in the center of the room with her usual grace, her shamisen cradled in her arms as she prepared to begin her performance. But as she lifted her instrument to play, she became aware of Takeshi's presence in his customary corner, his dark eyes fixed on her with the same intense attention he always brought to her music. The piece she had chosen was one of her most complex compositions, a musical narrative that told the story of a mountain stream flowing from its source in the high peaks down to the sea, encountering obstacles and changes along the way, but never losing its essential nature. Her fingers moved across the strings with practiced precision, drawing forth melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of water in motion, from the gentle trickle of a spring to the powerful rush of a waterfall. As always when she performed, the room fell silent except for the haunting voice of her shamisen. The music seemed to transport her listeners to the mountain landscapes she was describing, allowing them to experience through sound the journey of the stream from its birth to its ultimate destination. It was a performance of exceptional beauty and technical skill, the kind of artistry that had made her reputation throughout the region. But as the final notes faded into silence, instead of the usual appreciative murmurs and gentle applause, the room remained unnaturally quiet. Yuki looked up to see Lord Ishida staring at her with an expression of cold displeasure, his face set in lines of disapproval that made her heart sink with dread. "Interesting," Ishida said finally, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room tense with anticipation. "A mute geisha who thinks her silence makes her special, performing for a ronin who thinks his presence honors our gathering." The words fell into the hushed atmosphere, like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and embarrassment that spread throughout the room. Yuki felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, not for herself but for Takeshi, who had done nothing to deserve such public scorn. "My lord," Hanako interjected quickly, moving forward with the practiced diplomacy of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Perhaps there has been some misunderstanding. Our entertainers perform for all our guests equally, showing no favoritism to any particular patron." "Do they indeed?" Ishida replied, his gaze shifting to Takeshi with undisguised contempt. "Then perhaps you can explain why this person has been allowed to monopolize the attention of your most prized performer for weeks on end. Surely a man of his circumstances cannot afford the kind of patronage that would justify such exclusive treatment." The challenge in his words was unmistakable, and Yuki could see the tension building in Takeshi's posture as he struggled to control his response to the deliberate insult. She knew that his pride as a samurai, even a masterless one, would make it difficult for him to ignore such a direct attack on his honor and his right to be present in respectable company. "I pay for the services I receive," Takeshi said quietly, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of steel that suggested the violence he was capable of. "And I conduct myself with the respect that this establishment and its entertainers deserve." "Respect?" Ishida laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "What does a man who abandoned his duty know of respect? What does a coward who fled rather than face the consequences of his failures know of honor?" The words hit Takeshi like physical blows, and Yuki could see the pain they caused reflected in his eyes. But more than pain, she saw the familiar weight of shame and self-doubt that he carried like a burden too heavy to bear. The cruel accuracy of Ishida's attack suggested that the daimyo knew more about Takeshi's past than he had revealed through casual observation. "My lord speaks of matters he does not fully understand," Takeshi replied, his voice still controlled but with an edge that warned of dangerous currents beneath the surface. "Do I?" Ishida stood, his movement causing his retainers to shift nervously as they prepared to support their master in whatever confrontation might follow. "I know that you were ordered to eliminate a traitor to your domain and chose instead to warn him of his danger. I know that your failure to follow orders allowed a seditious poet to escape justice and spread his poison to other provinces. I know that you fled like a dog when called to account for your betrayal." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Every person in the room now understood the true nature of Takeshi's disgrace, the specific failure that had led to his current status as a masterless wanderer. Yuki felt her heart breaking for him as she saw the shame and pain written across his scarred features, the weight of judgment that he had carried alone for so long now exposed for all to see. But as she watched him struggle with the public humiliation of his deepest shame, something inside her rebelled against the injustice of it all. This man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who had seen past her silence to the person she truly was, who had chosen mercy over duty and paid the ultimate price for his compassion, he did not deserve to be destroyed by the narrow-minded cruelty of those who valued conformity over conscience. Rising to her feet with a fluid grace that commanded attention, Yuki moved to stand beside Takeshi, her presence a clear statement of support that surprised everyone in the room, including him. She looked directly at Lord Ishida, her dark eyes blazing with an intensity that seemed to fill the space around her with electric energy. Then, for the first time in her 19 years of life, Yuki opened her mouth and spoke. "He chose love over law," she said, her voice emerging clear and strong despite years of disuse, carrying a musical quality that seemed to transform the very air around her. "He chose mercy over murder. He chose to save an innocent life rather than preserve his own position. If that is cowardice, then I pray that all men might be such cowards." The shock that rippled through the room was palpable. Hanako gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the young woman she had believed to be mute. The other entertainers and customers sat frozen in amazement, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Even Takeshi stared at her in wonder, his eyes wide with disbelief and something that might have been awe. But Yuki was not finished. Years of silence had given her words a power that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard them, and she used that power now to defend the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. "You speak of honor, my lord," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But what honor is there in killing poets? What glory in silencing those who speak truth to power? This man sacrificed everything he had, his position, his family, his future, to save one innocent life. That is not the action of a coward, but of a hero." Lord Ishida's face had gone white with shock and rage at being challenged so directly, especially by someone he had dismissed as a mere entertainer. "You dare to lecture me on honor," he sputtered. "You, a mute geisha who has been deceiving everyone about her condition." "I have never claimed to be mute," Yuki replied with calm dignity. "I simply chose silence, because I had nothing to say that the world was ready to hear. But now I have found something worth speaking for, a man whose courage shines brighter than all the empty honors that lesser men cling to." The confrontation had reached a point where violence seemed inevitable. Ishida's retainers had their hands on their sword hilts, while Takeshi had shifted into a combat stance despite being unarmed. The atmosphere in the room crackled with tension as everyone waited to see who would make the first move. But before the situation could explode into bloodshed, Hanako stepped forward with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing powerful men and their fragile egos. "My lords," she said, her voice carrying the perfect balance of respect and firmness, "perhaps this evening has provided enough excitement for all concerned. Lord Ishida, your usual room has been prepared with our finest sake and most skilled entertainers. Takeshi-san, I believe it would be best if you took your leave for this evening." It was a diplomatic solution that offered both men a way to withdraw without losing face, and after a moment of tense silence, both seemed to recognize the wisdom of accepting it. Ishida allowed himself to be escorted to a private room by several of the tea house's most experienced geishas, while Takeshi gathered his swords and prepared to depart. But before he could leave, Yuki caught his arm, her touch gentle but insistent. When he turned to look at her, she saw in his eyes a mixture of gratitude, wonder, and something deeper that made her heart race with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "Meet me in the garden at midnight," she whispered, her voice so soft that only he could hear. "There are things I need to say that cannot wait for another day." He nodded silently, understanding that this evening had changed everything between them, that the revelation of her voice had opened doors that could never be closed again. As he walked away into the night, Yuki felt the weight of her decisions settling around her like a cloak. She had broken her silence, revealed her secret, and challenged one of the most powerful men in the region, all for the sake of a masterless samurai whose only crime had been choosing compassion over duty. But as she looked around the room at the faces still staring at her in amazement, she felt no regret for her choice. For the first time in her life, she had used her voice not just to make sound, but to speak truth, to defend someone who mattered to her more than her own safety or reputation. And in doing so, she had discovered that silence, while powerful, was not the only way to communicate the deepest truths of the heart. Act 3. The Voice of Truth. At the stroke of midnight, Yuki made her way through the darkened corridors of the Crimson Lotus toward the garden where Takeshi waited. The tea house had finally settled into quiet after the dramatic events of the evening, but she could feel the weight of whispered conversations and speculative glances that would follow her for days to come. Her revelation had shattered the carefully constructed image that had defined her for years, replacing the mysterious mute geisha with something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The garden was bathed in moonlight, its carefully tended paths and ornamental features transformed into a landscape of silver and shadow that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. Takeshi stood beside the pond, where they had shared so many conversations, his silhouette dark against the reflected light of the stars. When he heard her approach, he turned, and she could see in his face the same wonder that had marked his expression when she first spoke in his defense. "I thought I might have dreamed it," he said softly, as she joined him beside the water. "The sound of your voice, the words you spoke, it seemed too miraculous to be real." "It was real," Yuki replied, marveling at how natural it felt to speak aloud after years of silence. Her voice, though rusty from disuse, carried the same musical quality that made her shamisen playing so compelling. "As real as the courage you showed when you chose to save an innocent life rather than follow orders that violated your conscience." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, both adjusting to this new dynamic in their relationship. The barrier of her muteness had been such a fundamental part of their connection that its removal felt like stepping into an entirely different world, one where possibilities existed that had never been available before. "Why?" Takeshi asked finally. "Why did you choose to speak tonight, after so many years of silence? And why did you choose to defend me, knowing the cost it might bring?" Yuki considered his questions carefully, understanding that her answer would shape not just this moment, but the entire future of their relationship. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of truth that had been building inside her for weeks. "I was not born mute," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "I chose silence when I was 7 years old, after witnessing something that taught me the danger of speaking truth in a world that prefers comfortable lies." She paused, gathering the courage to share a story she had never told another living soul. "My parents were not poor farmers who died in a plague, as Hanako believes," she continued. "My father was a court musician in Kyoto, a man of great talent who served in the household of a powerful daimyo. My mother was a lady-in-waiting to the Lord's wife, a woman of education and refinement who taught me to read and write before I could properly walk." Taishai listened with the complete attention he had always given to her written words, understanding that she was trusting him with secrets that could destroy her if they fell into the wrong hands. "One night, when I was 7 years old, I witnessed my father's lord ordering the execution of a group of retainers who had questioned his decision to raise taxes on the peasants during a year of poor harvests. They were not traitors or criminals. They were loyal men who had served faithfully for years, but who could not in good conscience support a policy that would cause starvation among the people they were sworn to protect." Her voice caught slightly as she relived the memory, but she forced herself to continue. "I watched from a hiding place as those good men were forced to commit seppuku for the crime of speaking truth to power. And I saw my father, who had been ordered to compose a song celebrating their deaths as necessary sacrifices for the greater good, weep as he wrote music to honor their treachery." "What happened to your parents?" Takeshi asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. They began to speak quietly among the other servants about what they had witnessed, about the injustice of punishing loyalty and conscience. Word of their conversations reached the Lord, who decided that they had become a liability that could not be tolerated. They were accused of sedition and executed within a week. Yuki's voice remained steady, but Takeshi could see the pain in her eyes as she recalled the trauma that had shaped her entire life. "I was hidden by a servant who took pity on me, smuggled out of the compound in a cart of laundry, and eventually sold to a traveling merchant who brought me to the mountains. By the time Hanako found me, I had already learned that speaking truth could cost everything you loved, that silence was the only safe response to a world that punished honesty with death." "So you chose never to speak again," Takeshi said, understanding now the depth of courage it had taken for her to break that silence in his defense. "Until tonight," Yuki confirmed. Until I met a man who had made the same choice my parents made, who had chosen conscience over safety, and paid the same price they did. I could not stand by and watch you be destroyed for the same courage that cost them their lives. Sai felt tears burning in his eyes, as he fully grasped what her revelation meant. She had not just spoken to defend him. She had broken a vow of silence that had protected her for 12 years, had risked exposing secrets that could bring the same fate that had befallen her parents, all because she believed his choice had been the right one. You understand now why I could not remain silent, she continued. You are not a coward or a failure. You are a man who chose love over law, mercy over murder, conscience over convenience. You are exactly the kind of person my parents died trying to protect, and I would rather face any danger than allow their sacrifice to be meaningless. The weight of her words settled between them like a bridge across the chasm that had separated their worlds. In sharing her deepest secret, Yuki had revealed not just the truth about her past, but the depth of her feelings for him, the connection that had grown between them over weeks of careful conversation and mutual understanding. What happens now? Takeshi asked, though he suspected that their options were limited and dangerous. Now we face the consequences of speaking truth, Yuki replied with a sad smile. Lord Ishida will not forget tonight's humiliation, and he has the power to make life very difficult for both of us. Hanako will have to decide whether my value as a performer outweighs the trouble my revelation has brought to her establishment. And we will have to decide whether what we have found together is worth the risks that come with it. And what have we found together? Takeshi asked, though his heart already knew the answer. Love, Yuki said simply, the word carrying all the weight of truth that had been building between them for weeks. Love that transcends the barriers of speech and silence. Love that sees past scars and shame to the person beneath. Love that chooses courage over safety and truth over comfort. Takeshi reached out and took her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and experiences. I love you, he said, the words carrying the same musical quality that marked her voice. I love your courage, your compassion, your willingness to risk everything for what you believe is right. I love the way you see beauty in silence and find truth in the spaces between words. And I love you, Yuki replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. I love your integrity, your refusal to compromise your principles, even when it costs you everything. I love the way you listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart, the way you see past my silence, to the person I truly am. They stood together in the moonlit garden, two souls who had found in each other something they had never dared to hope for: acceptance, understanding, and a love that was strong enough to face whatever challenges the world might bring. But even as they celebrated this moment of connection, they both understood that their declaration of love was also a declaration of war against a society that would not easily accept their choice to be together. We cannot stay here, Takeshi said finally, voicing the reality they both had to face. Lord Ishida's influence extends throughout this region, and he will not rest until he has found a way to punish us both for tonight's defiance. If we remain, we will only bring danger to Hanako and the other women who work here. Where can we go? Yuki asked, though she had already made peace with the idea of leaving the only home she had known since childhood. There are places, Takeshi replied, echoing the words he had once spoken to another young woman in need of escape. Remote villages where a Ronin and his wife can make a living teaching children to read and write. Communities where people care more about character than social status. It will not be easy, and there will be dangers, but we will face them together. His wife? Yuki asked, her heart racing at the implication of his words. If you will have me, Takeshi said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made him seem younger despite his scars and his years of hardship. I have nothing to offer you but my love and my protection, no wealth or position to make your life comfortable. But I swear to you that I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you have given me. You already are worthy, Yuki replied, her voice filled with the certainty that came from seeing clearly into another person's heart. You have shown me what it means to be truly heard, truly seen, truly valued for who I am rather than what others expect me to be. That is worth more than all the wealth and position in the world." As they made their plans for departure, speaking in whispers that carried the urgency of lovers planning an escape, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the tea house. Hanako stood at her window, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was about to lose the most gifted performer her establishment had ever known, but also filled with a mother's pride at seeing her adopted daughter choose love over safety. She had suspected for weeks that this moment would come, had seen in the growing connection between Yuki and Takeshi the seeds of a love that would not be contained by the boundaries of their current world. And while the practical part of her mind mourned the loss of revenue and reputation that their departure would bring, the part of her that remembered her own youth and the dreams she had sacrificed for security rejoiced that Yuki would have the chance to choose differently. In the morning, she would help them prepare for their journey, would provide them with money and supplies and letters of introduction to people who might offer them shelter and employment. She would face Lord Ishida's anger and the whispered speculation of her other customers, would rebuild her establishment's reputation and find new entertainers to replace those she was losing. But tonight, she simply watched as two people who had found something precious and rare made the choice to fight for it, regardless of the cost. In a world that often seemed designed to crush the human spirit, their love represented a victory of hope over despair, of courage over fear, of truth over the comfortable lies that most people chose to live by. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Yuki and Takeshi made their final preparations for departure. They would leave as the town still slept, traveling the mountain roads toward a future that was uncertain but filled with possibilities that neither could have imagined alone. Act 4. The Song of Freedom. 3 years later, in a small village nestled in a valley so remote that it appeared on no official maps, the sound of children's laughter mixed with the gentle melody of a shamisen being played in the schoolhouse that served as the heart of the community's educational efforts. The building was simple but well-maintained, its wooden walls decorated with examples of student calligraphy and paintings that spoke of young minds being nurtured and encouraged to grow. Inside the single large room that served as both classroom and performance space, Yuki sat before a group of 20 children, ranging in age from 5 to 15, her shamisen cradled in her lap as she prepared to begin the day's music lesson. Her appearance had changed little in the 3 years since her departure from the Crimson Lotus, though there was a serenity in her expression that spoke of a woman who had found her true calling in life. "Today we will learn about the music that lives in silence," she told her students, her voice carrying the same musical quality that had first amazed the customers of the tea house. Not the absence of sound, but the spaces between notes that give melody its meaning, the pauses that allow music to breathe and grow. The children listened with the rapt attention that marked all of Yuki's lessons, understanding instinctively that their teacher was sharing something precious and important. She had become beloved in the village, not just for her skill as an educator, but for her ability to see potential in every child, to find ways to help even the most struggling students discover their own unique talents and abilities. Sensei called out a young girl named Mei, whose own struggles with a speech impediment had made her particularly responsive to Yuki's teaching methods. "Will you play the song about the mountain stream again? The one that tells the story without words?" Yuki smiled and positioned her shamisen, her fingers finding the familiar patterns that had once moved audiences in the most exclusive tea house in the region. But now, as she played for these children who had never known luxury or refinement, the music seemed to carry even greater power and meaning. Here, in this simple schoolhouse, her art served not to entertain the wealthy, but to educate and inspire the next generation, to plant seeds of beauty and culture that would grow and flourish long after she was gone. As the haunting melody filled the room, carrying its wordless story of water flowing from mountain peaks to distant seas, the door at the back of the classroom opened quietly to admit a tall figure whose presence immediately commanded the attention of every child in the room. Takeshi entered with the silent grace that marked all his movements, his arms full of the wooden practice swords he had been crafting for the older students' martial arts lessons. The years had been kind to him, softening some of the harder edges that had marked his features during his wandering days, while adding a sense of purpose and contentment that made him seem younger despite the passage of time. His scars remained, but they no longer seemed to define him. Instead, they had become simply part of the story of a man who had found his way from darkness into light. Takeshi-sensei. Several of the children called out in greeting, their voices filled with the affection and respect that he had earned through patient teaching and unwavering kindness. He had become not just their instructor in the martial arts, but a father figure to many of them, a man who taught them that true strength came not from the ability to defeat others, but from the courage to protect those who could not protect themselves. "Continue with your lesson," he said softly, settling onto a cushion at the back of the room where he could watch both his wife and their students. "I am here only to listen and learn." Yuki's music flowed on, weaving its spell over the assembled children, and carrying them on a journey through landscapes they had never seen but could experience through the power of melody and imagination. When the final notes faded into the warm afternoon air, the room remained silent for a moment, as if the students were reluctant to break the spell that her playing had created. "Beautiful as always," Takeshi said, his voice carrying the same wonder that had marked his first hearing of her music years ago. "But I think our students are ready for something new today. Perhaps the song you have been working on in the evenings." Yuki felt a flutter of nervousness at his suggestion. The piece he was referring to was something she had been composing in secret, a musical autobiography that told the story of her journey from silence to voice, from isolation to love, from fear to courage. It was deeply personal, more revealing than anything she had ever shared publicly, but she had been considering whether it might be appropriate to share with their students. "What song is that, sensei?" asked Taro, one of the older boys whose own difficult background had made him particularly responsive to stories of overcoming adversity. Yuki looked around the room at the eager faces of her students, these children who had come to trust her completely, who looked to her not just for education but for guidance and inspiration. Many of them carried their own burdens, poverty, family difficulties, physical or emotional challenges that made their lives harder than they should be. Perhaps her story, honestly told, might give them hope for their own futures. "It is a song about finding your voice," she said finally, her fingers moving to the familiar positions on her shamisen. "About learning that silence can be powerful, but that sometimes the most important thing you can do is speak your truth, regardless of the cost." As she began to play, the melody that emerged was unlike anything her students had heard before. It started softly, tentatively, like the first words of someone learning to speak, then grew stronger and more confident as it progressed. The music told a story without words, but somehow the children understood every chapter, the fear that led to silence, the years of isolation and longing, the moment when love gave her the courage to break her self-imposed vow, and finally the joy of finding her true voice and purpose. When the song ended, there was not a dry eye in the room. Even Takeshi, who had heard fragments of the piece during her evening practice sessions, was moved to tears by the complete performance and the courage it had taken for her to share something so personal with their students. "That was your story, wasn't it, sensei?" asked Mei, her own voice barely above a whisper. "It was," Yuki confirmed, setting aside her shamisen and looking around the room at the faces of the children who had become like her own family. "And it is your story, too, in a way. We all have voices that deserve to be heard, dreams that deserve to be pursued, truths that deserve to be spoken. Sometimes the world tries to silence us, to make us believe that we are not important enough to matter. But that is never true." "What happened to the people who tried to silence you?" asked Taro, his young face set in lines of anger at the injustice his teacher had faced. "Some of them are probably still out there," Yuki replied honestly, still believing that power gives them the right to decide who gets to speak and who must remain silent. "But they no longer have any power over me, because I have learned that the most important voice is the one that speaks from the heart, and no one can take that away from you unless you let them." "And you found Takeshi-sensei because you chose to use your voice to defend him?" asked another student, piecing together the romantic elements of the story. "I found him because we recognized something in each other," Yuki said, glancing at her husband with a smile that carried all the love and gratitude of their years together. Two people who had been hurt by the world, but who refused to let that hurt make them cruel or bitter. Sometimes the most beautiful connections happen between people who understand what it means to be broken and choose to heal together. As the afternoon lesson drew to a close, and the children began to gather their belongings for the journey home, Takeshi moved to stand beside his wife, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, in a gesture of support and affection that had become as natural as breathing. "I am proud of you," he said quietly. His words meant for her alone. "For sharing your story, for trusting our students with your truth, for continuing to choose courage over comfort." "I learned from the best teacher," Yuki replied, leaning into his touch with the contentment of someone who had found her perfect complement. "A man who showed me that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is choose love over law, mercy over duty, truth over safety." As the last of their students departed and the schoolhouse settled into the peaceful quiet of evening, Yuki and Takeshi began the familiar routine of preparing for the next day's lessons. They worked together with the easy coordination of partners who had learned to anticipate each other's needs and movements, their conversation flowing between practical matters and deeper reflections on the day's events. "Do you ever regret it?" Takeshi asked as they arranged the children's writing materials for the morning calligraphy lesson. "Leaving the Crimson Lotus, giving up the life you had built there." "Never," Yuki replied without hesitation. "That life was beautiful in its way, but it was not truly mine. I was performing a role, being what others expected me to be, rather than who I truly was. Here, with you, with our students, I am finally living as myself." "And what about your voice?" he continued. "Do you miss the power that your silence gave you, the mystique that made you so sought after?" Yuki considered his question seriously, understanding that he was asking not just about her past but about her contentment with their current life. When she answered, her voice carried the certainty of someone who had found her true calling. "My silence was powerful," she said, "but it was also a prison. It protected me from some dangers but cut me off from so many possibilities. Now when I speak, my words carry the weight of choice rather than necessity. When I teach our students, when I tell them stories, when I say I love you to my husband, every word is a gift I choose to give, not a performance I am required to deliver." As the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled any artwork in the most exclusive establishments of the great cities, Yuki and Takeshi stood together in the doorway of their schoolhouse, looking out at the simple village that had become their world. It was not a life of luxury or fame, not the kind of existence that would be celebrated in songs or remembered in history books, but it was a life of purpose and meaning, built on the foundation of love and sustained by the daily choice to use their gifts in service of something greater than themselves. "The children are learning so much," Takeshi observed, watching as several of their students practiced their calligraphy in the fading light outside their homes. Not just reading and writing and music, but how to think for themselves, how to question authority when it conflicts with conscience, how to find their own voices in a world that often tries to silence them. "They are learning what we learned," Yuki agreed. "That true strength comes not from the ability to conform but from the courage to be authentic. That the most important battles are often fought not with swords but with words and choices, and the willingness to stand up for what is right." As they prepared to close the schoolhouse for the night and return to their small home on the hillside above the village, Yuki paused to look back at the room where she had shared her story with their students. The space seemed to hold echoes of all the lessons that had been taught there, all the young minds that had been open to new possibilities, all the seeds of change that had been planted in fertile ground. "Do you think they understood?" she asked. "The real meaning of the story, the importance of finding and using their own voices?" "They understood," Takeshi assured her, his arms slipping around her waist as they walked together into the gathering darkness. "And more importantly, they will remember. Someday, when they face their own moments of choice between safety and truth, between silence and courage, they will remember their teacher who chose to speak when speaking was dangerous, who chose love when love required sacrifice." "And perhaps," Yuki added, her voice carrying the hope that sustained all great teachers, "they will make the same choice. Perhaps they will find their own voices and use them to make the world a little more just, a little more compassionate, a little more willing to hear the truths that need to be spoken. As they reached their home, a simple but comfortable dwelling that they had built together with their own hands, Yuki paused to look up at the stars that filled the mountain sky like scattered diamonds. Somewhere out there, in the great cities and exclusive establishments they had left behind, other voices were being silenced, other truths were being suppressed, other loves were being sacrificed to the demands of social convention and political expediency. But here, in this remote valley where their influence might seem small and their impact limited, they were fighting back in the most powerful way they knew how, by teaching the next generation to value truth over comfort, courage over safety, love over law. It was a quiet revolution, conducted not with weapons but with words, not through violence but through the patient work of education and example. "Come inside," Takeshi said gently, understanding the direction of her thoughts. "Tomorrow will bring new students, new lessons, new opportunities to plant seeds of change. Tonight, let us simply be grateful for what we have found together." As they entered their home and settled into the peaceful routine of their evening, Yuki reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the silence of her childhood trauma, to the voice she had found in love, from the gilded cage of the Crimson Lotus to the simple freedom of their mountain village, from the isolation of her muteness to the connection she had discovered in teaching and marriage, every step had been necessary, every choice had led to this moment of quiet contentment. She had learned that the most beautiful voice was not necessarily the loudest or the most technically perfect, but the one that spoke truth with courage and love with authenticity. She had discovered that the greatest freedom came not from having no constraints, but from choosing which constraints to accept and which to reject based on one's own values and convictions. And she had found that the most profound silence was not the absence of sound but the presence of understanding, the kind of communication that happened between hearts that had learned to hear each other across all the barriers that the world might place between them. As she drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who had taught her that love was worth any risk, Yuki smiled at the thought of tomorrow's lessons, of the young voices that would fill their schoolhouse with questions and laughter, and the endless possibility of minds learning to think for themselves. In teaching them to find their voices, she had finally found her own true purpose, and in that purpose she had discovered a happiness that no amount of fame or luxury could have provided. The feared Ronin and the silent Geisha had become simply Takeshi and Yuki, teachers and partners and guardians of the next generation's dreams. And in that transformation, they had found something more precious than any treasure, the knowledge that they had used their gifts not for personal gain, but for the betterment of the world, one student at a time, one lesson at a time, one voice at a time. This story reminds us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it, that the most powerful voice is often the one that has learned the value of silence, and that love has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Yuki's journey from enforced silence to chosen speech shows us that our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths when we learn to see them through the eyes of love and purpose. Takeshi's transformation from a man haunted by his past to a teacher shaping the future demonstrates that redemption is always possible for those willing to use their experiences, both good and bad, in service of something greater than themselves. Together they prove that the most profound changes often happen not through grand gestures, but through the patient work of daily choices made with integrity and compassion. Their love story transcends the boundaries of speech and silence, showing us that true communication happens not through words alone, but through the willingness to see and accept each other completely. In a world that often values conformity over authenticity, their relationship stands as a testament to the power of finding someone who hears not just what you say, but who you truly are. If this story touched your heart, leave the word Sakura in the comments, so I know you stayed until the end. And if you want more stories of love conquering fear and truth triumphing over silence, don't forget to check out the other tales I've shared. Thank you for joining me in this journey through Edo period Japan, where we learned that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from hearts that have learned to sing together in perfect harmony. Remember to share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters, that their truth deserves to be heard, and that love has the power to transform silence into the most beautiful song of all. If this tale stirred something deep within you, subscribe to Whispers of Silk for more stories that whisper truth in the quiet of the soul.